Hi, my name is Jo Brooke, and I want to talk to you about some of the extraordinary things that people did with the dead in Bronze Age Britain. Now, I want to start with this example, which is a whistle made from a human femur, and it comes from an inhumation burial in Wiltshire. The object was scraped out internally and polished on the surface, and there were originally a couple of blowholes to make it into an instrument. And it was found alongside a burial. Um, this is one of a series of possible really interesting relics that my colleague Tom Booth and I dated for a project on the curation of human bone, the curation, that is the keeping of human bone in Bronze Age Britain. Now, what we noticed is that fragments of human bone are often found alongside other burials, but they're often explained away as accidental inclusions, and we wanted to ask if that was really the case, or whether pieces of human bone might have been curated and then deliberately deposited as relics with later burials. This is a nice example. This is Redlands Farm from Northamptonshire, where there was an early Bronze Age grave which contained the inhumed body of an adult female. And she was, as with many early Bronze Age inhumations, she was provided with a whole series of grave goods, and you can see them here. But alongside these grave goods, there were also some little bits and pieces of human bone belonging to other people. So there were two incisors, a skull fragment and a possible pelvis fragment from a second adult. And there was also a humerus fragment from a sub-adult. And that humerus fragment was radiocarbon dated by the excavation team, and it was found to have been about 200 years older than the inhumation burial itself. But what I find really fascinating is that in the publication of this burial, those human bone fragments are not shown in this diagram, in this plan of the grave itself. So they're not being considered by the excavators as possible grave goods. In other words, the assumption is that they're accidental inclusions. And I just wonder about that. Might people not have deliberately incorporated these fragments of human bone as relics to accompany this adult woman when she was buried? So that is really what Tom and I wanted to look at. Now, it's actually the case that it's been recognised for a very long period of time that British Bronze Age mortuary practices were quite varied and involved quite interesting and different ways of treating the human body. So here's a publication, a little figure from a publication dating back to 1973, in which the excavators recognised very complex post-mortem treatment of the body that didn't fit with the kind of standard models of a straightforward burial of the body after death. So here we have the inhumation burial of an adult male in a cyst, but the skull is missing. And I'm hoping you might be able to see my mouse. You see there's no skull down there. And several of the other bones had also been moved from their correct anatomical positions. So the left and right part of the pelvis had been transposed, for example. And what the excavators argued was that the cyst was too substantial for the capstone, that would have originally been a capstone on this grave, to have been removed after the body was inserted. So this is probably not something, this disturbance, if you like, the body is probably not something that happened after burial, but instead the burial itself, the body itself may have been placed in this cyst in a partly decomposed or skeletonized state, and the bones then arranged, if you like, to simulate a crouched inhumation. So people have realized that there's this interesting kind of range of different practices in the Bronze Age mortuary tradition for quite a while. But nonetheless, I think the dominant image of Bronze Age burials in the archaeological imagination and in the public imagination as well is of single burial of complete bodies shortly after death. There's an assumption that this was the norm, but was it? So here's the Amesbury Archer, which probably many of you will know, and this is the kind of quintessential image, if you like, of single burial in Bronze Age Britain. But what we decided was that, in fact, the discovery of fragmentary and disarticulated human bone in Bronze Age graves suggested, in fact, a more complex and variable picture. So we carried out a program of C14 dating to see if there was evidence for deliberate curation. Could we show that there was a statistically significant difference, for example, between the dating of human remains and the dating of the context from which these were recovered? And we also undertook histological analysis to investigate the post-mortem history of individual bone fragments. So the current archaeology article that some of you might have read sets out some of the results of the project, but what I want to do today is look in a bit more detail at a few of the individual contexts, which provide evidence for some really interesting and diverse practices. So here's Cniep Headland on the Isle of Lewis. And this particular feature, the whole series of graves at this site, this particular one contained the incomplete and partially articulated skeleton of an adolescent male. Now, several of the there were several articulated thoracic vertebrae which were out of alignment with the rest of the spine, and other bits and pieces of the body were also misaligned. I think I've lost my, see if I can get my mouse back. Here's the left fibula, for example, which was found behind the upper back at a distance from the rest of the lower body where it should have been. And then the right humerus over here was also dislocated from its expected position, which suggested that these elements of the body had been skeletonized at the time of burial. You can also see that there's quite a gap between the head and the torso, and then between the torso and the lower body, suggesting that the body might have been buried in several parts. And this is what the excavators suggest. Most of the left hand and the wrist bones are present, suggesting that the body was partly fleshed on burial, but there were quite a lot of other bones that were missing, including most of the right arm and both of the feet. So Tom and I modelled the dates in Oxcow, and we were able to suggest that the bones of this adolescent were somewhere between 3 and 82 years old on deposition. So in other words, they were older than the grave into which they had been placed. Now, Tom undertook histological analysis on the bone, and this indicated very low levels of bacterial bioerosion to the internal bone microstructures. And this indicates that the body was probably subject to some kind of post-mortem process that arrested the normal process of physical decay. So I suppose together, that piece of information, the partially articulated nature of the remains, and the C14 dates would be consistent with a form of post-mortem treatment such as mummification. So here you have somebody who was not buried immediately after death, but was kept somewhere, potentially mummified, kept somewhere for between 3 and 82 years before he was finally interred in the ground. This is another example, and it raises some quite different but related questions. It's Melton Quarry in East Yorkshire, and here it's unfortunately, sadly, not this particular lovely inhumation of around the same date, but the one I'm going to talk about. No photos actually survive for it, unfortunately, in the archive. But the one I'm going to talk about anyway was a complete inhumation burial, but nestled between the torso and the legs of that burial were the disarticulated and incomplete remains of an infant. And the remains of that infant were somewhere between 185 and 346 years old on deposition, which is really interesting, because I suppose when you find an adult and a child buried together, you think, oh, this must be mother and baby or father and baby or whatever. But that baby, that infant, was between 185 and 346 years old on deposition. So this is an individual who had been curated, their bones kept over a very long period of time. Now, again, histological analysis indicated very low levels of bacterial attack to the bone microstructure, in contrast with the accompanying articulated burial, which was had extensive bacterial bioerosion. So what we would suggest is that the infant, the disarticulated remains of the infant, had probably been subjected to some kind of post-mortem treatment such as excarnation. And I would suggest that probably those bones were kept in a bag, and then they were buried a couple of centuries down the line with this adult individual. So I suppose if that was not parent and child, this does raise the question of who were the curated dead. And I suppose that, you know, I guess that we would interpret the kind of intimacy of the physical connection between whole bodies in the grave and bits and pieces that are found with them to suggest that maybe the fragmented, disarticulated bones that were redeposited with subsequent burials might have been significant ancestors. And we know, for example, from lovely linear barrow cemeteries, or at least we would suggest from linear barrow cemeteries like this one in the vicinity of Stonehenge, that kinship relations, ancestral relations, were probably a very significant element of Bronze Age social structure. Certainly in southern Britain, you often have these very linear arrangements of barrows within early Bronze Age cemeteries, and people have interpreted this to indicate that genealogical connections with significant ancestors were a key component of social and political identity during this period. And there's other evidence to suggest this might well have been the case too. So the well-known grave of the Boscan Bowman, just down the road from the Amesbury Archer, and you may know this grave also, has had lots of radiocarbon dating done on it, also some ancient DNA analysis. Now, one of the primary occupants of this particular grave is this inhumed adult here, and you can see there are a couple of redeposited skulls at his feet. Now, this adult male, plus one of the disarticulated skulls, I don't quite remember which one, were shown through aDNA analysis to be second or third degree relatives. The skull in question was somewhere between 0 and 87 years older than this particular guy, so it had been kept for some period of time. So that and the genetic relationship suggests that probably these were, well, they could have been half siblings, or they could have been genetic paternal cousins, or possibly they might have been uncle, or, you know, the skull might have belonged to an uncle or a grandfather, but there's some kind of paternal relationship there. There's genetic kinship, which suggests that social kinship, familial relationships were important in determining who was buried with whom, and which piece of curated bone you might choose to have buried with you when you died. So I suppose that one of the questions that rose for us out of these various examples was, were these known ancestors? I guess that in comparison with Neolithic monuments, where bones of the dead are all mixed up together, there's this sense that these were sort of generalized ancestry in the Neolithic. In comparison to that, in the Bronze Age, these kind of specific genealogical relationships might have been important. So maybe the identities of the curated dead were known and were important. Now, what we found with our chronological modelling was that the kind of median period of curation for fragments of bone, of human bone from mortuary contexts, was around 95 years, or 3 to 4 generations. Now, that's kind of the extent, if you like, of living memory. Anthropologists talk about communicative memory, for example. Communicative memory is essentially transmitted in the context of everyday interpersonal interactions, and it differs from cultural memory, which might refer to sort of longer term processes of the institutionalization of memory through myths, rituals, and so on. So communicative memory, anthropological studies indicate that these sort of living memories, if you like, can be maintained over 80 to 100 years, 3 or 4 generations, which is exactly the kind of the standard a period for which, or the median period for which fragments of human bone were curated in the Bronze Age. So one of the really interesting things, excuse me, about the British Bronze Age is that there's a complete change in what happens to the bodies of the dead after about 1100 BC. From this point onwards, mortuary rites, excuse me again, are actually now archaeologically invisible, and we don't know how the bodies of the dead were treated, or at least how the bodies of most of the dead were treated. And what you do find is fragments of unburnt bone and token deposits of cremated bone, very commonly incorporated into the settled landscape, into settlements, into houses, into various features, pits and ditches and so on around the settled landscape. They're no longer in barrows, in landscapes of the dead. They're part of the landscape of the living. So these include, for instance, a skull, a complete skull, found in a midden deposit adjacent to a roundhouse at Must Farm in Cambridgeshire. And again, many of you will be familiar with the site, the amazing Bronze Age site at Must Farm. And here's another example. Again, this one would be very, very characteristic. Here, there was part of an unburnt human skull, so again, a skull fragment, found in the basal sills of a waterhole that formed part of an extensive open settlement. So in the later Bronze Age, after sort of 1100 BC or so, you actually find human bone. Not only it's in the settled landscape, but it's in what one might term often in what one might term liminal locations, sort of marginal boundary locations towards the edges of settlements, and also in contexts such as wet places. And here's one that we looked at as part of our project. This is 3 fragments of a human skull, which you can see up here on the plan, which were found just next to, well, on the edge of a mound of a burnt mound, a mound of burnt stone. And to the other side of this mound, there had been a deposit of a hoard of weaponry, swords, ferrules, spears, and shapes deposited. And you can see the location. Oh, I haven't marked it on here. I can't remember. Let me see. Oh, there it is, the hoard. So you can see here it is. The hoard is it's at the fen edge, just on the other side of a field system that runs down from the dryland down to the fen. This is the fen here. So the wetland, if you like, and here's the dryland. So it's just at that kind of liminal marginal boundary location between wetland and dryland, just on the other side of the settled landscape, if you like, in the watery world beyond. But interestingly, what we found when we compared dates on those skull fragments to dates previously obtained on a wooden spear shaft and on peat from within and around the hoard, is that there actually was no statistically distinguishable difference, statistically identifiable difference in date. So these human skull fragments had not been curated for a long period of time. And in fact, that's what you find in the Middle and Late Bronze Age settlement context in general. When you find human bone fragments from those contexts, a much smaller percentage of those finds were curated. So when we compared earlier Bronze Age mortuary contexts and later Bronze Age settlement contexts and looked at the human bone from those and whether they were curated or not, we found that around 20% of our fragments of human bone that came from later Bronze Age settlement contexts in the broadest sense, and that includes contexts like these in and around field systems, for example, about 20% of those were curated in comparison to more than 50% of fragments of human bone from earlier Bronze Age burials, the kinds of context that I was talking to you about a little bit earlier on in this talk. And the other interesting thing is that in the later Bronze Age, there's much more evidence for violence. And I think this tells us something interesting about changes to who was deposited in these sorts of deposits containing fragmented and disarticulated bits of bone. So here, a couple of examples from Cliff's End Farm in Kent. This is the skull of an adult woman from a very interesting mortuary deposit. And in fact, she's an old woman, elderly woman, and she has sustained a very deep blow from a sword to her skull, which has killed her. Here, this is another deposit from Bradley Fen in Cambridgeshire, so the same site that we saw in the previous slide. And this was a young female who had been deposited prone, head first, face down, into a Bronze Age waterhole in what you might interpret as a fairly disrespectful form of deposition. So you might argue that, or you might suggest that there's a very interesting change going on between the earlier and the later Bronze Age. In the earlier Bronze Age, people are mostly redepositing, they're circulating, curating, redepositing fragments of the ancestral dead, people with whom they had close interpersonal ties, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, their grannies, their great-grannies. Whereas in the later Bronze Age, the bits and pieces of fragmented dead that you find in waterholes and under roundhouses and so on, some of them were curated, yes, but generally not for very long. And probably they weren't all kin. They probably were from a mixture of different, they represent possibly a mixture of different kinds of social relationships. Many of them might have been enemies rather than kin. So there's this really interesting difference in patterns of curation and patterns of deposition between the earlier and later Bronze Age in terms of human remains and sorts of fragmentary, disarticulated pieces of human bone that one finds in these different contexts. And that difference across the earlier Bronze Age to the later Bronze Age, that tells us something really interesting about forms of society. So just to, I suppose, bring that all together, the evidence, I suppose, in terms of broader things we can say about the Bronze Age, the evidence suggests that there was relatively little concern to maintain the integrity of the human body. And this is quite different to maybe our own experience and our own perception of what should happen with the body on death today. So in the Bronze Age, bones were removed from the dead through a variety of processes for curation, display, and deposition elsewhere in the landscape. Sometimes they may have been recovered from existing burials. Existing burials seem to have been re-entered with the express purpose of extracting bits of ancestral bone for various ritual purposes. Elsewhere, practices such as excarnation may have been employed to fragment unburnt bodies. And all of this suggests a very different set of ideas about the body and the self. It was ideologically acceptable to fragment the human body. And Bronze Age concepts of the self didn't prioritize an ideology of bodily integrity in the same kind of way that we do. And I imagine that Bronze Age people would not have been disgusted by the remains of the dead. And certainly in the later Bronze Age, they're very much part of the world of the living. They're under your house floors. But whether those are, granny or your enemies is it's another question. And I think the important thing about this process of fragmentation, circulation, redeposition is that it gives material form to interpersonal relationships. Human bone is used in a variety of significant social and ceremonial settings, even to the extent that occasionally, as we've seen right at the start of this lecture, human bone could be made into objects that could be used, like the whistle that I spoke about. And I suppose then, human bone, whether it was a relic belonging to an ancestor or the skull of an enemy, had an important social and political role. It referenced not only the dead, but it also communicated really important aspects of the identities of the living and their relationships not only with the dead, but with each other. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening.